What's up, everybody? Welcome to Pants' Guide to Season of Discovery Phase 4 for Shadow Priest. So I want to talk about what's new for Shadow Priest, how we are doing in Molten Core, and how you can best prepare for this phase. So let's get to it. The first thing that I want to start with is what new runes does Shadow Priest have? The first one is Vampiric Touch, which is what a lot of us thought we were going to get this phase. So this is a dot that deals a little bit of damage, but whenever it is on your target, it returns 2% of any shadow damage you deal to that target as mana to your party. Who doesn't love having more utility? It also automatically applies Vampiric Embrace to your target, which is a very nice quality of life feature because you can spam Vampiric Touch and put Vampiric Embrace onto multiple targets, and you don't need to worry about the cooldown that Vampiric Embrace has on it. You can just mass apply this to everyone. You can get this rune by clearing the last boss in the new dungeon, Demon Fall Canyon. There is a very quick attunement to this dungeon, and I'll put that on the screen here for you to follow if you want to do that. The next rune that we get is Shadow Specialization. So this just gives us 6% hit as a rune on our ring. It's really nice, and this is in the Tainted Scar in the Blasted Lands, which is around the area that Lord Kazakh spawns. Between this rune and our talent Shadow Focus, you will be hit capped and you do not need any hit rating from gear. Now let's talk about rune changes this phase, because not all the runes are the same as they were last phase. The first one is Pain and Suffering. This no longer only refreshes Shadow Word Pain, but now it refreshes Vampiric Touch, Shadow Word Pain, and Void Plague when you cast Mind Spike, Mind Blast, or Mind Flay. This is really strong and allows us to snapshot dots, and I will talk about that in the snapshotting section. Void Plague is now no longer on our chest slot and is on our boot slot, so it is annoying that this competes with Dispersion in PvP, but in PvE this is a very nice buff because we can now have Twisted Fate on our chest slot and Void Plague on our boot slot. Now let's talk about talents. I'm going to have two different setups here depending on what your preference is. The first one on the left goes into the Holy Tree to pick up a few points in spell warding to reduce spell damage that you take. The second tree on the right is going to dive further down the Discipline tree to pick up some mana regen talents. Now the thing that these trees both share is that they're no longer picking up improved Shadow Word Pain. Because Shadow Word Pain gets refreshed by your Pain and Suffering, you do not need this talent. Okay, now let's talk about runes. This is going to be your single target setup on the left, and on the right, you're going to swap in Mind Seer and Void Zone for AoE. Now, Void Zone is a really strong AoE tool, but it's not something you need all of the time, and this is really going to show itself when you have full tier 1 and you're using world buffs. Using Void Zone means you can't use Despair, and Despair does buff up your Mind Seer, as it makes your Mind Seer crits do 200% damage instead of 150% damage. Void Zone may always be the superior AoE choice, but if you only want to swap one rune, it could be easier just to swap in Mind Seer for AoE fights and then swap back to Shadow or Death for single target. Note that Shadow or Death really doesn't do a whole lot of damage. It's only about 80 DPS in full tier 1 Bis with world buffs, and when you have less than 40% crit with tier 1 6-piece, you will not be using Shadow or Death anyway, and I'll talk about that in the rotation. But it could be a good idea just to always run Mind Seer, especially if you're someone who's speed running, because Shadow or Death is kind of a bad spell. The best use of Shadow or Death is to cast while you're running, since it's an instant cast ability, but using it in your standard rotation does not give you that much extra damage. Okay, now let's talk about your rotation. You technically have 3 different rotations that you will use throughout this phase. They are all very simple, but there is some nuance to them. Now the difference in these 3 rotations is the first one will be before you have tier 1 6-piece. The second one will be when you have tier 1 6-piece but less than 40% crit. And the third one will be when you have your tier 1 6-piece and over 40% crit. The reason for this is because your Mind Spike increases the critical strike chance of your Mind Blast by 30% for each stack of the debuff on your target. Your tier 1 6-piece gives you an improved Mind Flay every time after you crit with a Mind Blast. And this effect is very strong. You gain upwards of 500 DPS from the tier 1 6-piece bonus. An update is that this tier set just got nerfed. This was as I was editing the video and almost hit export. This 6-piece bonus only buffs Mind Flay damage by 50% instead of 100%. This is about a 25% damage nerf to Mind Flay, as it deals 150% damage instead of 200% damage. This is about a 230 DPS nerf versus what I'm showing on the screen. The tier bonus is still insanely good, and this nerf does not change anything that I'm going to talk about in this video. So our goal is to make sure that every single time we cast Mind Blast, we get a critical strike with it when we have the tier 1 6-piece. That's why this 40% crit threshold is so important. So your rotations look like this. First things first is apply your dots for all 3 rotations. After that, for your normal rotation before tier 1 6-piece, your priority will be Mind Blast, followed by Shadow or Death, followed by Mind Spike. It's pretty simple. When you get your 6-piece bonus, but before you have 40% crit, it will be 3 Mind Spikes into a Mind Blast, followed by another Mind Spike, and then Mind Flay. The reason we have another Mind Spike after our Mind Blast is because the buff on your character does not always update immediately. So if you queue a Mind Flay after your Mind Blast, it might not have the empowered effect. So you want one cast in between those to make sure that you have the effect on your character before you cast Mind Flay. And when you have over 40% crit, then those 3 Mind Spikes turn into 2 Mind Spikes and a Shadow or Death, Mind Blast, Mind Spike, and then Mind Flay. So putting this all together in a priority system looks like this. First, cast your dots on your target and maintain them on your target. Next would be Empowered Mind Flay, followed by Mind Blast when you have a guaranteed chance at a critical strike, followed by Mind Spike when you don't have a guaranteed critical strike on your target with Mind Blast, followed by Shadow or Death, followed by Mind Spike if you already have 3 stacks on your target, but all of your other abilities are on cooldown. Now remember, this is a priority system, not necessarily a cast sequence. Okay, now let's talk about Snapshotting. Now, Snapshotting only exists because of the Pain and Suffering rune. Because we refresh our dots through our Mind Spike, Mind Blast, and Mind Flay abilities, we can maintain the spell power and critical strike chance of our dots indefinitely. Ideally, you're only casting your dots once on a fight. That's because when you first start a fight, you want to use all spell power and crit enhancing abilities that you can. So this means if you have an on-use trinket that has a lot of spell power, such as Talisman of Ephemeral Power or Draconic Infused Emblem, you use that before you cast your dots at the start of a fight. You can also snapshot the bonus spell power from Power Infusion, and you can snapshot the crit from Inner Focus onto one of your dots. This would be best used on Void Plague because it is our strongest dot. You can also snapshot the spell power from the Mildly Irradiated Potion from Alchemy. So your opener on a fight would look like this. 1.5 seconds before your fight starts, you want to use all of your spell power trinkets, your potions, get your PI, whatever that might be. So you have all of your spell power buffs on your character 1.5 seconds before the fight starts. You cast Vampiric Touch so that it lands on the target as soon as the fight starts. Then you use Inner Focus onto Void Plague, and then you cast Shadow Word Pain. And then by performing your rotation normally, all of your dots should stay on your target. The only time they should fall off is for an intermission, such as Ragnaros when he submerges. Other than that, every single fight you should be able to maintain your dots. Now on fights with multiple targets where they share an HP pool, or Majordomo where you want to AoE everything down, maintaining your dots does not matter, so I would not worry about it there because your main form of damage is going to come from Void Zone and Mind Seer. Shared Pain is useful to maintain Shadow Word Pain on some targets as well, but you're not going to be refreshing it through Mind Spike or Mind Blast. It's better just to cast a single Shadow Word Pain to apply it to 3 targets at once. Okay, now let's talk about Molten Core and your best gear setups. This is really going to depend on if you're doing heat level 1, 2, or 3. Now, if you want to see a world first clear of heat level 3, then you should watch my video here because my guild did accomplish that. If you're just doing heat levels 1 or 2, then your BIS gear is actually just your BIS gear. You will have plenty of fire resist in that set from tier 1. So let's start with Heat 1 and Heat 2 BIS gear. There's actually 2 different sets you can use, and they sim about the same. So if you're tailoring, then the first set is going to be tier 0.5 gloves, Fel-infused legs, and the rugged mantle of the Timbermaw as your shoulders. And then you fill in the rest with tier 1. The non-tailoring Bis, which sims about 4 DPS worse than this set, uses tier 1 legs and then tier 0.5 gloves and shoulders. The 2-piece from tier 0.5 actually outweighs using the fell-infused legs, so even though those legs are insanely good as a single piece, you do not want to use them instead of having the 2-piece from tier 0.5. Now let's talk about heat level 3 Bis. I'm going to assume that you are using Juju Embers and that you have AD Exalted. If you do not, then at the end of this I will talk about what items you sub in instead. So this set is extremely similar to the heat level 1 and 2 Bis set as well. The difference here is that you're using full tier 1 because of the fire resistance that you get on those items. And then you're just swapping in the fire resistance enchants. That's the only difference between heat level 1 and 2 and then heat level 3. But again, this is assuming that you are Argent Dawn Exalted and using Juju Embers. If you do not have those, then your set is going to change. You will want to use the Title Loop as your ring instead of Ring of Spell Power. If you need more fire resistance after that, I would swap in the Fine Flare Core legs. Those should be the only swaps you need, even if you're going for the super casual heat level 3 setup, since tier 1 and the fire resistance enchants cover a lot of the fire resistance that you need for heat level 3. If you need one more item for whatever reason it might be, then the Fine Flare Core chest is going to be your next best option from a DPS perspective. And then just for your knowledge, some other items that are really good FR and really cheap, though really bad DPS options, are on the screen here. If you're leveling an alt or you're just trying to get a caster ready for heat level 3 but you don't really care about how much damage they do for some reason, then these are the items I would target first before sinking gold into the flare core options. Okay, so we talked about best gear setups. Now let's talk about best professions, as that's going to impact the gear that you have. Now the 2 best professions from a DPS increase are Tailoring and Alchemy. Tailoring from the Rugged Timber Maul Shoulders, or whatever it's called, and Alchemy from the Mildly Irradiated Rejuvenation Potion. So this potion is actually from the Gnomer Crafting quest line, and it only gives you 35 spell power. This is best used when snapshotting your dots, but this does have some drawbacks. It reduces your movement speed by 50% and increases damage you take from physical, nature, and shadow sources by 100% for 20 seconds. So it can be deadly if used at the wrong time. But in a true Bis setup, these are the 2 professions that you want. I personally think that the Tailoring Shoulders are highly overrated, as they're only 10 DPS better than a true Bis option, and they don't have any fire res, which means if you're doing heat level 3, they're kind of a liability in that slot, and you should probably go for tier shoulders instead. I will be speedrunning MC at heat level 3, so I am going to be Alchemy and Engineering for that. Now, one other thing to mention is if your raid does not have an enchanter, then having somebody with the new sigil from Revered Hydraxian Warlords is incredibly strong, because not only is it 30 spell power for you, but it's 30 attack power and spell power for everybody in your raid. So you want at least one person with enchanting in your raid. And if nobody has that, then it could be a good option for you to pick up. Okay, now let's talk about consumables and enchants. I'm going to put them on the screen as the best FR options for you. I will also include DPS options. This is going to be a mix and match of what you're going to do for your own goals. It depends on how much fire res you are targeting in your sets, so pick and choose accordingly. All right, now let's talk about priest racials. Since you can pick an extra racial, it's important to know which ones are best. Now, this is going to depend on which race you are, because you can get an additional racial on top of whichever one you currently have. So from a PvE perspective, Fear Ward and Devouring Plague are going to be best. Fear Ward's just a really nice all-around ability to have, and Devouring Plague is going to be our strongest DPS option. Now, it's only about 15-20 DPS, so it's not particularly great, but it is the best DPS option of all of the abilities. From a PvP perspective, Fear Ward and Shadow Guard are going to be your best options. Shadow Guard is really nice because it can proc Blackout, which means if a rogue opens on you and just gets stunned immediately, well, fuck that guy. So it's really nice to have, and it's probably my favorite racial of all of them, but I'm going to keep Fear Ward because I am a PvE Andy. Anyway, that's all I have for you in this guide. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you have some fun in Molten Core. Anyway, my name's Pantsface, and I'll see you in the next one.